This video will focus on primary release dynamics plus Azure.json. As I mentioned down at the bottom here, the video assumes you watched part 1 because it builds on part 1. This template builds on the original template and adds deployment of Azure components to the release to demonstrate deploying a release across both. So in order to understand what's going on with this release, it's probably worth drawing a diagram. So in this scenario, we have a Dynamics 365 instance. We have a user. It's going to fill out a form. It gets served up by Dynamics 365. They submit their data back to Dynamics 365 by saving the form. In there, the data gets stored to an entity, which initiates a plugin execution, which makes a call out to an Azure service bus queue and drops a message in the queue. Then we have an Azure function app that is listening for and picking up messages off the queue, executing some logic, and then making a web service call back to Dynamics 365 using the new web API and updating some data in the record that was originally submitted. So as you can imagine, we have a lot more to deploy and a lot more to configure. Not only do we have to deploy and configure the Dynamics 365 solution package here, but we also have to provision the Azure Service Bus namespace and the Azure Service Bus queue. We have to provision an Azure function app. We have to then deploy code to the Azure function app and configure the Azure function app to know to read from the queue and know which is the correct Dynamics 365 web service endpoint to call to submit data back into Dynamics 365. We also need to tell the Dynamics 365 plugin through secure configuration what the connection string is for this particular Azure Service Bus queue that gets provisioned. And we want to do all of this in a way that the values can change from dev to test to prod, and we can deploy it to each of those environments. All right, so let's take a look at an implementation of this release deployed to Visual Studio Team Services. So I'll go ahead in here and I'll edit. And similar to our previous release, we're deploying artifacts from a build to an environment. And very much like the previous release, we could build a dev, test, prod, etc. environment. But the point of this reference implementation is to get you started and evolve it to work for your target environments. So I'll go ahead and click on here and take a look at the tasks. So if we look back at the diagram, first thing we have to do is provision what's called an Azure Active Directory application, which gives this code permission to call into Dynamics 365. So to do that, we install the Azure Active Directory PowerShell modules. We download a little script that I authored that you can go look at, and then we pass that script the name of the app that we want to register, the username and password that has the permissions to create that registration. So what does that look like? If I come over here and I scroll down here to Azure Active Directory in the Azure portal, select app registrations, you'll notice I have an app called Azure Function App. And that app has the required permissions to access CRM Online as organization users. If I come back over here, you'll notice that my variable is Azure Function App. That's what creates what we just saw here. Notice it's called Azure Function App. And if I go back to the task, or the tasks, this is what gets created. And the way this script is written is that if the app doesn't exist, it will go ahead and create it. If it does exist, it'll just keep going to the next set of tasks. Now, one thing to note is that I wasn't able to find a way to grant permissions in an automated fashion. So while all of the subsequent tasks, well, these set of tasks and the subsequent tasks will execute successfully if you set all your configuration information right, the actual Azure code will not execute successfully unless somebody who has rights comes in and clicks this grant permissions button. So again, the app and the permissions will get provisioned correctly, but you have to manually, the first time you deploy a brand new app registration, you have to click grant permissions. All right, so after we register the Azure AD app, you'll see some things that look similar to the more basic template, the Dynamics only template. And as I mentioned last time, these 3 steps essentially get us set up to reset the Dynamics 365 instance using the new online management API. As I also mentioned in the previous video, there's a good chance by the time you actually try to import these yourself, these 3 will be replaced with a task that has an icon like this that encapsulates all the functionality of these 3. Once we've reset the Dynamics 365 instance, we need to create and deploy an Azure resource group. So what does that look like in Azure? Looks like this. A resource group is a container that has one or many Azure services in it, and there's a way in Azure to deploy this in a programmatic and automated way. So let's go over and look at Visual Studio. You'll notice we have a project called Azure Resources and a file called Azure Deploy.json. This is the resource manager template. It's a JSON file. And in our case, we are creating an Azure storage account. We are creating an Azure function app, which runs on top of Azure App Service. We are then creating an Azure Service Bus namespace and an Azure Service Bus queue. And so this step will read that JSON file, tell Azure to provision all of these things, which will result in those things being built out inside of an Azure resource group. Once we've done that, we need to get the outputs from the deployment. So if we go back to our Azure deploy.json file, notice there's an output, which is the connection string that gets created after this Azure Service Bus queue is provisioned. And so we're going to need that value in subsequent steps, including deploying the configuring the logic app and secure configuration. But before we do that, now that we've got the Azure services provisioned, we actually have to deploy the code for the logic app. So if you go back into source code here and you open the Azure function app project, this builds a DLL and a set of functions that get deployed to Azure function app. And so far we just have a queue listener that reads information from configuration to know how to read from the queue and call back into Dynamics. And so this just deploys the output of what gets built as part of the build. Once that's deployed, and the code is running, the code needs the right configuration values. So we use another task, which basically targets changing the configuration settings of the function app, passing it all the values that we have here in variables that get built as these other tasks are executing. So we scroll down here, we're setting things like the Azure Service Bus connection string, the information so that the code can get a token to call to pass to Dynamics CRM so it can make web service calls, which web service endpoint to call, which version of the Dynamics 365 web API. Once all that's done, then this should be familiar. This was in the previous video. We deploy the solution package and the sample data to the CRM instance. And last but not least, we let the CRM instance know via deploying through secure configuration. We let it know how to make calls back to that Azure Service Bus queue. And again, that's done through a variable that composes from other variables. So we get that connection string that was created by Azure and passed over to us, and we specify what queue to dump the messages into. And so that's the set of tasks necessary to deploy across both Azure and Dynamics 365, since this application uses a combination of the two services in its implementation. So to deploy this, we'll go back over to Chrome here. There is our previous release that we imported in video 1. And before we actually import the release, we're going to have to add a couple things from the Visual Studio Marketplace. So let's come up here and go to visualstudio.com. Click on the Marketplace. Make sure we're filtered down to Visual Studio Team Services. In this case, we want Azure App Service. So that's the task that I used for configuration. So let's go ahead and install that. Confirm. The next thing we want to look for is ARM output. That's the task I used to get the outputs from the ARM template. So we'll install that. Close that out. Now if we come back and we import that release definition, this time we want primary release dynamics plus azure.json. We'll import that. And one of the things you'll notice is the steps to get this going is a little bit more involved than the first video. As with the first video, we have to delete this primary build because it's referencing a GUID that's sitting in a Visual Studio Team Services project that this project knows nothing about. So we'll remove that, and then we'll add the one that we already have. So we'll use the same build from the previous video. Click Add. Next thing we'll do is we'll select the tasks here. We have to make sure that we pick the hosted VS 2017 agent queue. These should be okay, but if you scroll down and we select, for example, the create or update Azure resource group, you'll notice the Azure subscription isn't selected because, of course, you have a different Azure subscription than the one I had in my other VSTS project that I referenced. And so I already have one that I've created here. If you don't have one, you'll come through here and you'll click New. You'll create one. This gives your VSTS releases a reusable subscription with credentials set up once for the automated deployment. But that step is sort of out of the scope of this. There's certainly documentation on visualstudio.com how to set this up, but you need to create one of these. So this is one of those times in the video you might want to pause, go create your reference to your Azure subscription so that you can get to the point where you can use it to keep configuring this release. So the other thing we need to do is select which location the resource group will get deployed to, and hence the other resources. In this case, I'm going to pick East US. Similarly, we go down here. We have to pick that subscription again. Very similarly, we pick that subscription here. Again, on this step, from almost all of these Azure steps, you're going to need to select that subscription. And then we need to change the variables. And the process here is very similar to the first video, except there's more values that you need to configure. So we called this app Azure Function App. And yes, this one's already created, but in a brand new scenario, as I mentioned before, the script will go ahead and create it. Notice that this one says temp. This will be replaced in a task. So the actual register Azure AD app PowerShell script will take care of setting this variable. You can go take a look at that script to see how it actually works. Then you need to provide your resource group. So if I come over here, again, this all will install on top of the existing one, but if you don't have one, it'll create it. We'll provide that resource group name, the unique name. That's this right here. But again, you can name it your own unique name. Same thing, your Dynamics domain. So this is dyn365-ce-devops-part-two. Again, some friendly name, testing DevOps with Dynamics and VSTS. Similar to the previous video, we want it to be a sandbox instance when we do our reset. This is the management API URL. Again, if you were doing this with a different geo, this would be 4, 9, etc., depending on your geo. Here we need to provide a password. Again, it's secured using VSTS's ability to secure secrets. The secure config gets composed based on previous variable values. This is version 8.2. As I mentioned in the previous video, you can use the API or the PowerShell scripts to get the actual GUID for the version that you want to be provisioned for Dynamics 365 when you do a reset. The tenant is mark_sc. The user is mark_sc. And again, like before, I don't want this to say -copy, so I'm going to delete this and click save. If I did everything right, this should be ready for release. It is, so let's go ahead and create a release. We're going to use that same build. We're going to queue up that release. And remember, this was a manual trigger for the environment. So instead of the environment deploying when the release is created, we come in here and we manually click deploy to my environment. It queues up the deployment to the environment. And again, you can look at the logs. And very similar like the previous video, I'm not going to go through and make you watch all the tasks execute, but I will reiterate that similarly to the previous video, what you're going to want to do here is pay attention to whether the tasks execute successfully or not. If they don't, you want to look at the variable values to make sure that you don't have typos in your variable values, etc. A little bit of trial and error. Sometimes you get your variables wrong, but ultimately, if you get everything right, this should release. This release should deploy end to end from all the way from provisioning the Azure stuff, deploying to Azure, resetting the instance, deploying to Dynamics, updating all the configuration appropriately. All right, so in the interest of time, I've gone ahead and edited out the time it takes to run through all these tasks. But as you can see, they all executed successfully. All right, so in this video, I walked you through the Dynamics and Azure JSON release template, explained how it worked. I showed you how to deploy it. I showed you how to import it into your own Visual Studio Team Services project, get all the variables configured correctly so that you can successfully deploy it to your Dynamics 365 instance and Azure subscription.